34, episode 34. Pastor Greg Lee, thanks for coming, man.
Well, happy to be here.
Thanks for coming. So for those of you who don't know, you're the lead pastor at Sun Crest Church in St. John.
Yeah.
And I've had the blessing of being a part of this church now for about 2 years and serving a little bit just recently, which has been amazing.
Yeah.
I wanted to just have a conversation a little bit about your story and about everything going on at Suncrest, and and hopefully it speaks to somebody.
Yeah.
And like in the way that you've helped my life and my family's life. And so it's a little bit about your background. Where are you from originally?
Yeah.
Illinois, right?
Yeah. I'm from a small town, Camp Point, Illinois. 1,200 people, no stoplights,
Nice.
nothing like that.
No stoplight.
No stoplights.
Okay.
So,
My wife's from a town that has 2 stoplights.
Okay.
That's it. But
Yeah.
there's like 4,000 people. So maybe there's a correlation. Every 2,000 people you get a stoplight.
That's probably about right. That's probably about right. Yeah. So, but I loved growing up there, and my mom still lives there. My wife's parents, she's from the same area, so we go back there. But it was rural, central Illinois, kind of a very traditional growing up setting. And my dad was in the agricultural business, so we were very kind of connected to farming and agriculture, and loved it. Great people.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome. So did was your dad a farmer, or no? Was he in what did he do in the agricultural business?
Yeah, so he had a fertilizer business,
Okay.
and over the years he expanded it, multiple locations, things like that. Like kind of that entrepreneurial spirit,
Yeah.
is something I've definitely picked up from him. But I mean, he was a guy who cared about the community he was in. He wanted to be a leader in the community. Yes, to employ people and build a business, but also, to serve the town, to serve as a leader in the church. He's one of my heroes for sure. He passed away in 2015, and but I don't know, it shapes our lives. We ended up naming our youngest son after him.
No way. Well, what was your dad's name?
Warren Lee. Donald Warren Lee was his name, and when we adopted Davion, Davion was his given first name, and we gave him the middle name Warren and the last name Lee, so he's Davion Warren Lee.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so was your dad kind of when you were growing up, was your dad kind of the person you looked up to? And like you mentioned, he was kind of a hero to you. What was that like when you were younger as a kid?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. He was a hero. It's funny because hero probably is something that gets attached in retrospect a little bit. Like, oh, wow, he shaped my life in such significant ways. And I remember my experience with him was that he would push us, right? He had certain values he was going to embed in us, hard work probably being the top of that list for him. He was a man that did express his love. I know that's a very interesting conversation when I talk with guys about how did you relate to your dad in that way. But mostly I just think he was a stabilizing force who, set the big picture course for our family, and it shaped everything about us.
That's awesome. And your mom's still out there?
She is.
That's awesome. And did you meet your wife out there?
I did.
You're from the same town?
Yeah.
Man,
I mean,
that's awesome.
Jenny and I, we sat next to each other in the middle school band playing trumpet. This is the first time I met her, I think. So ended up dating in high school. It's kind of a sickening story if you want to hear it. Because,
absolutely, yes.
I mean, our first date was the homecoming dance.
Okay.
I was a basketball player. She was a cheerleader.
Nice.
Here we are years later, married 27 years now. So
that's awesome, man. Basketball player and the cheerleader. That's awesome. My wife was a cheerleader and I was a basketball player.
Is that right?
With different schools, though.
Okay.
We met each other later. But it's awesome, coming from such a small town, 12, 1,500 people, and then ended up, that's so cool.
Yeah.
To take the journey together, too.
Yes.
From, the start, because my wife and I have different, upbringings, different towns, different areas. So that's got to be really cool coming from the same area.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a natural trust that's been embedded in our relationship our whole lives because we know each other. Our families know each other. Jenny's parents they owned the restaurant in town. My dad owned the fertilizer business. It's it's good people from from the beginning. But yeah, we both did have a vision that though we like where we came from, it probably wasn't going to be our future, right? And so to end up in Northwest Indiana and Chicagoland, this has been good for our
That's
family.
awesome. That's awesome. That's kind of my wife says the same thing. Like her family's out there, and we love going out there. But she always just say like, I don't want to live here. Like I don't want my family here, but I love it there.
Yes.
So we go there, and like we do love it there. And then so I get that from her perspective. So when what were you like in high school? Did you know you were going to be a pastor in high school? Like, did you have an idea of calling at that early of an age? Like, or what were you like when you were in high school?
Man, what an interesting question. What were you like in high school? I'm like, well, I was awkward. I was a nerd, probably, trying to be a basketball player, but not that great at it. I think, when I look back on that, I did know probably from being 15 or 16 years old, sophomore, junior year of high school, that ministry was a calling on my life. And so, I mean, you can imagine, like, my kids went to Crown Point High School, like being that age in a high school environment, like not a lot of people are going to ministry. That's not the mindset. For sure. But, I think it actually helped me step back and start to understand people and people's different motivations and how to relate to them. And so, that kind of transformation happened in me middle of high school. And so then I set the course, ended up going to college, studied that in undergrad, and then of course seminary.
What led you to that point at such a young age? Because I actually get asked that question too from the real estate perspective, because I started at 18. Wow. And people are like, how'd you know, and the story, like I enjoy telling that story, but how at 15 years old, how did you know, like, okay, this is where, was that from your dad or was that from something else? How'd you have that calling? How did you live that way?
I grew up in church, and it was a positive experience for me. It wasn't a negative experience. Yeah. But there's something inside of me. I don't know why. I don't know if this is unique to me, but I feel like when I was in middle school and almost early high school, I kind of experienced church, and I even can remember thinking, I have to decide, am I going all in with this or am I not? Right? Because the people at church say this is the most important thing in your life. So it's either going to become the most important thing in my life, or I'm actually going to either walk away or just let it be a sideshow for me. And that was not an obvious question for me to answer. I mean, I had decisions I was making earlier in high school that no one would look at them and say, oh, those were godly decisions you were making, Greg. And that's true, but it also kind of jostled me in such a way to be like, well, who am I? Like, I don't want to be an inconsistent person. That would be one of the most tragic things for me. I want to be an integrated person. So faith, I let it rise to the top. I had some mentors in my life. So obviously my family shaped this. I had a youth pastor who, kind of was dropping the idea of being a pastor. And at first I was like, no, I mean, I'll be a business owner and I'll be a good church person as a business owner. But he kind of kept dropping it. I was like, maybe I have to think about that. And then I actually had kind of a transformational experience one summer at a camp or a retreat type setting that I was at, where I mean, it is hard to describe with words, but I had this overwhelming experience that I know was from God, and a sense to say, hey, will you trust me with this? And it's kind of wild because, today, I get the privilege of being a lead pastor at Sun Crest Christian Church. It's a large church, like life is good, right? But I grew up in a small church, where pastors made next to nothing. They had to live in the parsonage next to the church building. They moved every 3 years. My picture of what a pastor was not the life I wanted. And so to me, it was like, yes, God, I'll do that even though it's not the desirable life to me. It is what you're calling me to. And then I feel like this is how God works in my life a lot. It's like, okay, I was willing to make a sacrifice and step into it. When I did step into it, as it turns out, it's a great life. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I probably could have prefaced with this a little bit too. The reason that, people always say, right, don't talk about religion, politics, money, those things. I actually prefer to talk about all of those things.
It's real life.
Exactly. I think that a problem maybe that we've had in the world is that we don't talk about those things. Yep. And, is there someone that may watch this and say, well, I don't want to work with Alex because he's a Christian or because whatever it might be, and that's fine. I'm okay with that, and I respect that. Yep. But I think it's just I want to preface with because we're getting into it now. Like you mentioned, I had this overwhelming experience, and I want to talk about this stuff, man, because this it's so important in the world that we're living in now, with all of the noise and so many things that are happening and so many things taking attention from us, that there's there's a lot more good in the world than we're seeing, I think. And so this is a big part of it, man.
Yes.
Like my faith, and I want to share my story a little bit too in a little bit, but I love hearing your story at 15 because I think there's a lot more people that are young people that are experiencing these types of things, but they're getting counteractive in culture, and we'll talk about all that.
Yeah.
But the reason for this is because these are the conversations that I think are most important to have. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
At 15 to be like, I'm either going to go all in on this or not.
Right.
It's awesome. So then when did you start? So you went to school, college for ministry?
Yes.
And then how did that process go to where your first position was and so on?
Yeah, so, different denominations handle kind of education for ministry different ways. But the church I grew up in, you would go and do your undergrad work. So I went to school in Lincoln, Illinois, Lincoln Christian University, and got a bachelor's degree in Bible and ministry. And of course, that's the education part. But for me, it was like, I want to jump into the experience. So, the summer after my freshman year, I essentially volunteered to be the youth pastor at a church just to try to say, hey, what would that feel like, right? And honestly, I didn't like it for a few reasons. We could go into that if you want. But it kind of made me like, oh my goodness, I'm aiming my whole life at this and I'm not enjoying it. And then during my sophomore year, so I'm 19 years old, I got the chance to preach at a very small church every weekend. I was their pastor. Now, when I say very small, 8 people.
Wow.
10 people, 12 people, any given weekend.
I went to a church like that for a while in Valpo.
Yeah.
It was in a basement. There was 10, 15 people.
They, paid me $50 a week to come do a sermon, and they loved me, and they let me practice. And it actually, that kind of teaching part of it, the preaching part of it, kind of caught fire for me. So it's like, I always feel like, oh, I learn in a classroom, I can do that. But the best experience is to go out and do something, right? And so, that kind of shaped me through undergrad to say like, all right, this is where we go.
So you started with that youth pastor, then that small church. How did you end up? What was the story to get to Suncrest? How long ago was that?
Yeah.
How long have you been at Suncrest now?
Since the summer of '96. So,
okay. So how long has Suncrest been around?
So Suncrest started in '94.
Okay.
And it was about a year and a half old when I came.
Okay, got it.
And this is a great story because Suncrest has been
almost 30 years.
Yeah, it'll be 30 years this fall. We're gonna have our anniversary.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, and for you, 28.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, man.
So,
I didn't realize that's awesome.
Now, just to clarify, I was literally 21 years old when I came to Suncrest.
He's not that old. No.
Not that old. But I'll tell you that story because again, it's all part of like letting life unfold, right? Yeah. So the pastor who started Suncrest, his name is John Wassam, remains a life mentor to me. So he had started this church and it grew a little faster. They were meeting at Lake Central High School, grew faster than they thought, and they needed to add staff. So he was also teaching at the seminary where I was going to school. So
that was the connection?
So that was the connection.
Okay.
He got connected to me, and he said, hey, will you have lunch? Of course, I'm a poor college student. I'm like, if you're buying, I'm having lunch. And he basically said, we need to, add to our team. He said, I've heard good things about you. Would you come? And I was so fascinated by this church because it was new, it was vibrant, there was obviously things happening. And I thought, I'd love to say yes. But the offer was a part-time job, right? And I was getting married. Jenny and I were engaged. We're like right on the edge of that. And I said, John, I would love to come, but I can't. I got to get a full-time job. And this is not the way he would tell the story, but this is the accurate version of the story. He came back to me a couple weeks later. He's like, hey, will you have lunch again? I'm like, yeah, if you're buying.
Yeah.
And he came and he said, I got a new idea, Greg. How about you come and work full-time and we only pay you part-time? And I said yes.
That's the actual story. He said yes.
So
hey, I need a full-time job. I need some money.
Right.
All right, you can be full-time. We'll
so,
pay you.
I mean, a little explanation on that. In new church work, a lot of times staff members have to raise part of their own support from friends and family and churches. And so that was actually the model. Gotcha. Suncrest was going to pay me half the salary, and I had to go raise the other half of the salary for 2 years. And then they were confident they could bring me on full time. But it was like, that was a step of faith. I didn't want to go ask my friends and family for money and, that sort of thing. But it was like, but God's calling us to this. And that's how I ended up, at Suncrest. Here I am.
Wow. And Suncrest now, how as far, I mean, like you said, it's a good sized church, for our area.
Yeah.
And how like how many people go to Suncrest
Yeah.
now on a weekly basis? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean,
Three services,
Thursday nights and
Yep.
Sunday morning. Last weekend we had about 1,400
That's awesome.
people. So
That's awesome.
my wife teaches the 4 and 5-year-olds at the 10:30 service. She had 28 kids in her class, and it's just
that's a full class.
that is a full class, right?
That's
But it was
amazing.
just a reminder that like, oh, God's been good to us in the sense of reaching young families.
Yes.
Right. That's
Yes.
He's always had that as a priority for us, and we get to experience.
Well, I mean, and when you think about it, it's like that's so important. I mean, if you look at it from a strategic perspective, it's like, yeah, having young families is key.
Yeah.
And now when we drop our kids off, and that's
Mm-hmm.
part of the story of Suncrest for us, but when we drop our kids off, there's just so many young families and young kids, and there's
Yeah.
more just coming in. And
Yeah.
that's such a good indicator for how a church is doing and growing.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Okay, so now there's 1,500 people coming in every week, and you guys have built this amazing church. I guess you've seen it for 28 years.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not overnight. That's almost 3 decades of work, which I didn't even realize that's how
Yeah.
long it was. How was the process of building a church, and maybe what are some of the most important things that you found to get Suncrest to this point as a leader? Like, what have been some of the biggest keys for you guys in building such an amazing
Yeah.
church?
Well, of course, there's a lot. I think part of the beauty of what Suncrest is that there are certain values that have never changed for us. We know who we are and what God has called us to be. And, sometimes I say, and as long as I'm around, that's what we will be. That's not changing. And there are other places where it's like, oh, there's opportunities we didn't see before, and we need to make investments in those. So I say, well, there's some things that have never changed. Actually, one of the things I'd like to do, we help start a lot of new churches. That's one of the things Suncrest does. We've helped start over 70 new churches. Those 70 churches have started to over 700 other churches all around the world.
That's awesome.
But it's like, okay, what is Suncrest? Suncrest is an unselfish church. We're going to be generous to others. We're going to have a vision that's beyond ourselves. It's not just about our church. It's about, the kingdom of God. So that has never changed, will never change. And it's probably our biggest vision. Sometimes because I'm around those new churches a lot, I try to say, Suncrest is a 29-year-old church plant. And I say that because I want us to keep the mindset of when things were new, when they were beginning, the entrepreneurial days, the nimbleness that an organization can have as a startup, right? Because I think that's where the power is for innovation and reaching people that, aren't finding a home other places.
Yeah.
So those are, to live by faith, We're the kind of church that didn't have any money, didn't have a building, didn't have those things, and still felt called. Now we have a little more money and we have a building, but it doesn't change. We're gonna do whatever God's calling us to do.
Yeah.
So those all stay the same. What's changed? Well, Northwest Indiana has changed
For sure.
in 28 years, for sure. And I think we change with it, right? What's changed? Early on, I'd say probably for the first 20 years of Suncrest, we were deeply invested in people's spiritual lives and people coming into our church and seeing that transformation, but we were not deeply invested in meeting needs in the region. And we had some epiphanies, some conviction around that, some repentance actually to do on our part for not doing that for such a long time. And now, as you know, our For the Region efforts and the generosity toward that, the volunteers locally. I just told you I had a board meeting at Sojourner Truth House this morning. Like, we are deeply invested, yes, in the spiritual needs and the worship experiences and drawing people in, but in making. I feel like this is my conviction that the love for God is actually demonstrated by a love for people. Right? You can say you love God, but if you're not loving people, if you're not helping people, then actually the scriptures say this, then what are you doing, right? You're lying to yourself. And that compassion and love for people who aren't part of our church, people who are never going to benefit our church, this isn't to build us up. That's been probably the biggest transition for us over our time.
That is awesome. So the church now and the world that we're in today is definitely a lot different, at least from the way that I grew up. And I grew up in a little bit of my story, and hopefully this touches to some people. I grew up Catholic, so I went to St. Mary's in Crown Point. I'm born and raised in Crown Point. I've never left. I I used to think that was sad. I'm now so proud of it. It's
Yeah.
beyond crazy. But for a while, I was like, oh, that's kind of sad. Like now especially now with my kids and stuff, I love being from this area. But went to St. Mary's. My parents at a young age separated. My parents were together from when they were young, like 12, 13 years old. They separated when I was like 7, 8 years old, but still went to St. Mary's. And my parents experienced some stuff with my experience in Catholic Church was amazing. It really was. But I remember being young, and for some reason, even when I was in, Catholic, I feel a much deeper relationship now in like at Suncrest and in the way that church is today versus that time. But even at that time, I can't explain it. There was just always, like, God was always pulling at my heart. Always.
Yep.
And even when I was a Catholic, you're used to it. It's certain prayers, and it's kind of, you go through. It's not this high energy type of atmosphere like we have now.
Right.
But even then, I remember being 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, and just thinking like every single time I'd go to Catholic Mass and at school at St. Mary's, God was speaking to me in different ways. And even when I was like, is this real? Like, is this actually a thing? And still, and that happened even later in life. But even at that time, always there was, I've never seen anything. I've never heard audible from God. It's just always been, as we refer to it, the Holy Spirit. But it's always, in a way, just been in my mind. Like there's something that's happening here.
Some sort. Yeah.
Yes, something. And I would always just talk to God. I was never taught that, but even, in Catholic Mass, it's usually Hail Mary, Our Father, things like that. But for whatever reason, when I would pray, I would just talk to God. And no one taught me that. No one did. I just felt like, even at times of disbelief, times when things were not great, I just talked to God. And things would happen, right? Things would fall into place or not as they were supposed to, whatever would happen. And so, but when my parents separated, my mom started going to a non-denominational Christian church in Portage.
Okay.
And the process, so then I was going to Catholic Mass and something similar to Suncrest, 20, 30 minutes of music, 30 minutes of a message, and I was getting something from each. But from the time I was like 11 years old was when I started going to that church in Portage. Pastor Dwayne Schmidt, who is drastically impacted my life in so many ways, married my wife and I. Every weekend I'd listen to Dwayne talk. And before he would talk, though, the worship time, I'm 11, 12 years old. I'm an 11, 12-year-old boy. I'm not exactly an emotional time in life. But every single, since I was 11 or 12, I can count probably less than 10 times where I haven't been emotional in service. And I can't explain that. Like for me, it's just like every time there's worship, I'm tearing up. And other times I'm losing it. I can't explain it, but it's just like since I was a kid, God has pulled at me. And this is actually, I think it's pretty cool. But my wife used to always say, I met her at 19 years old, and she was the one that, like, at that time, she was very deep into her spiritual faith, and I knew that she was who I wanted to marry from the first time we had a conversation. We had a 2-hour-plus conversation, and I remember thinking, like, I'm going to marry this girl. But I was 19. I was nervous, scared, not the desire that I had at the time. But my wife, I found out, as time went on, my wife, when she was in high school and early ages, she was connected, similar church out in Napanee, Indiana, and she said she used to pray for her husband every day. She didn't know who her husband was, but she used to pray for him every day. And when I was in high school, I was around, kids. We were always having fun, like you mentioned, doing things that, wouldn't be so godly, right? But I was usually the one who was like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. Or if something went wrong, I was usually the one trying to save my friends from, or kind of like developed into a leader role, or like, hey, that's not the right thing to do.
Right.
Even though maybe I didn't want to do it that way, but I did. And I really think that had a lot to do with my wife praying for me, even though I didn't know who she was.
Yeah.
I think my wife was literally praying for me about, hey, I don't know who my husband is, but God, I just pray that you work in his heart. And at the time, God was always pulling at my heartstrings, you know? And this is before so many things. So when I was 18, 19, went down at University of Indianapolis, that was when my wife went to school, but I went to IU down in Bloomington, and just asking all these questions and just so conflicted, but also so, like, still so curious, and just and so when my wife and I had been dating for about a year, it got to the point where it was like, okay, I don't know, like, she was ready to basically, like, I'm done unless you're ready to commit, and I'm 19, 20, and I'm like, okay,
Like,
God, this would be we were in Arizona and at a business conference this place that we worked at the time. And I remember it was the day that she was like, I'm done. It was about a year in, and it was the day we're like, okay, I'm ready. So she was ready to leave.
Here we are, right?
Yep. She was ready to be like, I'm done. And I
Yeah.
was like, I remember talking to God and just saying, God, I don't know why you put this woman in my life, but this would be the biggest mistake I ever make in my life, is letting her go. And by only the grace of God did she stay with me for a year.
Yeah.
Before I was ready to make a commitment. And as time for me, it was just like, there's no way to explain in words.
Right.
But, and thankfully I had, a mom and a dad,
Mm-hmm.
but definitely my mom, they were very much, my mom was always, hey, come to church, and God was just always in different ways speak, even when I was so doubtful of like, and
Right.
all the things that you hear and all that, it just, to me, it's just like, the Spirit has just always been talking to me.
Can I make an observation
Please.
about that? Because I think
Sorry
I talk
for
to a
rambling.
lot of people. I hear their stories, and I'm fascinated by them, right? And what I notice is, and I think maybe this helps people think about it. In our spiritual development, there is, like all other development, an element of nature and an element of nurture, right? So nature being like kind of what's instinctive to me, right? And some of that's shaped by the home we grew up in, experiences we had, if you went to church or not. But I think, honestly, some people just naturally are more drawn toward and more open to spiritual things, and some people aren't, right? That's the nature part. And people who aren't, oftentimes it's later in life when, they go through an experience. It could be something beautiful. It could be suffering. It could be anything that kind of jostles them to be like, I need to really pay attention to the spiritual things. But the nurture part, like that's the part we control, right? And so I always tell people like, oh, the Spirit is going to do what the Spirit does, right? God is going to do what God does. We do have the ability to quench that Spirit. I mean, the Scriptures teach that very clearly. So I think what I see in your story is like, oh, you didn't quench the Spirit. You kind of let it keep breaking out in certain ways.
Yes.
And if I had advice to teenagers, especially, I'd be like, hey, just keep that door open.
Yeah.
To letting it break out.
Yes.
Don't let a social pressure,
Yes.
don't let a cultural pressure, don't let a view of yourself that's unhealthy quench that Spirit. Just keep that door open,
Yes.
and who knows where it will go.
That's awesome. And I feel like I know so many people that are around our age, maybe younger families or where we grew up with a different time that what church was like, right? Very
Yes.
traditional,
Yep.
and so I think there's a ton of people, because like you just said, I just kind of kept it open.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, where I'm at now, most of my goals now in life are related to my faith, which
Yeah.
is so, it's changed. But I remember at 19, 20, I'm like, no, I need to make money. I need to get things.
Right.
I need to build myself. It was all like desire and this and that. And, but I think that what you were just saying with, and I want to touch on this, the church that we grew up in, the church versus church now. Church now, I just feel like it's so much more inviting to keeping that open, like you just said. I grew up where it's like, hey, it's not just fire and brimstone if you do this and you need to say 10 Hail Marys. And by the way, that works for many people,
Yeah.
and regardless, I don't care how you get your faith.
Right.
And where you get it from. For me, I feel so much more fulfilled in the way that, for how Suncrest runs things. And I got so much value from St. Mary's. And we still give there because I love that church and I love that school and I love the people there.
Mm-hmm.
And it did so much for me. But the way that we grew up could turn a lot of people off. And so that was one of the things that I kind of want to touch on is like there's many things that happen along people's lives that if they may hear certain things, like you mentioned, social pressures or things that come up to where they kind of start to close that door.
Yes.
And that door gets closed until maybe one day it opens up again later in life, or maybe it never does. And I think there's a ton of people right now that are maybe closing that door or already have because of certain things. And I had kind of a list of a couple things. You did an amazing series where you just I loved this series where it was so cool. You just said, ask us questions.
Yep.
And so people could text in their questions.
Yeah.
And you stood on the stage and just read questions from people, everyday people who were non-believers, believers, Christians, not whatever, but they were asking questions and you're just answering them. And it was awesome. And so I think that there's a ton of people who've kind of, and my goal is not to I mean, obviously, I want to share my story.
Sure.
And I want to share the story of Suncrest because of what it's done for me. But I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I think more so just hearing from you, like your take on a couple things, because I know a lot of people they've closed that door.
Yeah.
And a lot of them comes from a couple of different things. So if you want to maybe we'll go quickly into a couple questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people who close that door from example, things like some people are raised too strict. Yes. Right. So, hey, you go to church, you do this no matter. And it's so much to the point where it turns them off and they're like, this is not, I don't want to live this way. Or too lenient. So their upbringing either closes that door because, hey, you just live life, do whatever you want. Or, hey, you're doing it this, you're doing it this.
Yep.
There's a lot of people, I think their upbringing kind of takes them away from church.
100%. So strict and lenient, I think those are two good categories. We all understand those words. But think about it just a little more. Strict, what happens in our faith becomes that our faith gets reduced to a set of rules, right? We're talking about having experiences with God. That's what faith should be. So if faith is only rules or only rituals or only, some religious practice, like you miss out on actually where the life and the beauty and the wholeness and the development comes from. So I absolutely agree that, man, if you grew up in an environment and your perception of religion is, well, that's a bunch of rules, then that can close you off in a way like, and I, of course, would just want to invite you to be like, oh, it's bigger than that. You should revisit that, But similarly, on like no rules, purely lenient, whatever goes, right? So we use the word rules, and rules probably has kind of a negative connotation in most adults' minds, at least. But maybe if you use the word standards, it would help us a little bit to think, no, my faith is rooted in something. It is not anything goes, right? And it's not like, oh, God is whoever I want him to be. No, it's like, no, there's actually something you can plant your foot on and build a foundation on and let it grow out from there. And so kind of the free-for-all, lenient piece, I think, people get just as confused about that because at that level, we become the center of the universe, right? Human beings become the center. And it's so wild. I'm going to do a series on Romans this year. But one of my observations is there's this very weird thing going on. And I'll just say this about Suncrest, not even about the whole world. I'm like, I think at Suncrest, people think of themselves more highly than they ought. Right? There's kind of this, you could almost call it arrogance. Like we kind of think of ourselves pretty highly, not collectively as a church, but as individuals. And at the same time, a lot of people are struggling with not feeling good about themselves, depression, the darkness, the dread. And I'm like, I hope people understand what's going on because what's happening is we're trying to find our identity somewhere outside of something that's rooted in reality of God. And if you try to do that, then you look at yourself as great, but you're empty. I have a pastor I respect. He says, essentially, you're far worse than you think you are.
Yeah.
And the grace of God is far greater than you think it is. And that's actually the flip reality, right? It's not that I think more highly of myself. I might be prone to acknowledge I'm actually not as good as I try to think I am. But thank God, His grace. And now I don't have to feel good about myself because of what I have done. I actually don't have to be depressed. I don't have to live in that darkness because I'm a child of God, and that's my identity. And it's not about me, but it gives me value. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Another one, the belief that a lot of people believe that religion is just about money.
Yeah.
So and as soon it's always tough whenever, like last week you did an amazing message on money. And I always love listening to you and Aaron Brockett talk about these things of Aaron at Trader's Point. But a lot of people do think like these churches are just, hey, give your 10% and that's it. And I have a very close person who had an experience like that, similarly at a different, way 20 years ago where, they got a divorce, blah, blah, blah. They needed to talk to the priest. And, the conversation was basically, well, when we'll set up a meeting when we start to see, your envelope again, and which, by the way, I understand why someone would probably close that door now.
Yes.
Because there's a very valid, these are all valid reasons for someone to say, well, maybe maybe I don't want to be a part of this, or maybe I don't believe in this, or I don't have faith in this, and I didn't preface with that. These are all valid reasons and things that
absolutely.
But for that particular situation, it was like, yeah, well, and that person's barely gone to church. They're thankfully they are still a believer, but like they don't have a church. It's been 20 years,
Yeah.
And so we'll when we start to see your envelope a little more, we'll set up a meeting. So what do you say about that?
Well,
People who think that it's about money.
Sadly, I've heard the same thing, and I know there are some headlines out there about religion and money and churches and money. Like we're fighting those perceptions all the time. But I think fundamentally that experience this is why that experience is so bad, as it is that your experience at the church is conditional. It's conditional on whether you're giving money or not. And I think your experience with the church should be, in our best representation, your experience with God. Now, we'll get it wrong. Churches are not perfect representations of God by any means. But a church shouldn't interact with you in a way that's conditional on your generosity or your volunteerism or anything else. You're a human being, right? Like we're open to everyone. And obviously generosity is an important part of church life and Christian life, but it should be the response to your experience with God, not the entry gate to your experience. So no, we would never, no healthy church, honestly, would send an invoice to people, say, well, this is what you owe, before we're going to do business. Mm-hmm. It has to be the opposite of that. And I want generosity to flow out of wow, God has been great. So let it come from there.
I think that, and this ties into one of my favorite things that you talk about, which is that, because people see churches and they're like, oh, well, this religious leader did this. And that's usually the headline, something bad happens, or, they're buying private jets and spending all this. So, but you talk about this a lot. It's like a lot of people are turned off by religion, Christianity, because there's, or have closed that door because they see how Christians act, and or religious leaders and religious people, and they're like, so these are supposed to be the people that are telling me how to live my life and telling me how to act with morals, and this is what they're doing.
Yes, yeah.
So there's a lot of that.
Massive barrier, and I just I love to tell people that I drive a van with 318,000 miles on it. Right
in the middle of this, I was going to say, did you drive the van here?
I did, and it's actually too much pride on my part that I drive a van with that many miles on it.
That is the ultimate flex,
right?
My minivan's got 300,000 miles. Like, I wish I had that flex. Every time you talk about it, I'm like, I want to say that.
Yeah. But I do. One of our leaders asked me like, why do you tell that story? And I'm like, because I actually am aware that there's a perception that, I don't know, lead pastor, big church, he's probably got a jet somewhere. Like I know there's headlines out there about that. But listen, I live in the region, as you know, I'm a fan of all churches, and like the churches here are healthy, right? I'm not just speaking about Suncrest, but it is like, it's not just the pastors, right? And it is Christians. And I mean, I come back to a story a lot that's actually about Gandhi, when he was not a follower of Jesus, and explored it for a little bit. And his conclusion was, I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. And I'm like, that's unfortunately, I think, could be said by anyone walking down the street right here in Crown Point right now. Their experience. And so a lot of times I find the barrier to faith with people today, like I like to have intellectual conversations and answer your questions about your dilemmas with the Bible, or whatever. But I think most people's dilemma with faith is, it's not so much that they don't believe, it's that they look at other Christians and be like, I don't think you really believe. At least the way you're living your life, the way you're handling things, why would I be drawn to that? So yeah, our healthy Christian witness is so important. And unfortunately, I think the critique is valid a lot of times.
This is one of my favorite topics that you talk about, because it's like, you see things like this, and I'll see someone who, calls himself a Christian, and then how they handle themselves in their business.
Yes.
And it's like, I constantly just try to reflect on, like, I've really finally started to, like, actually listen to what Jesus said and how he acted. Yeah. And that a lot of times I'll find myself now, I'm starting to catch myself. Like, you got to respond differently to this.
Yeah.
Like, that, like, in just the whole WWJD, it's like, what would Jesus do? It's like, I actually will stop myself. Like, all right, and I'm not a theologian.
Uh-huh.
I do not understand.
Mhm.
I've read this much of the Bible. I finally finished Matthew.
Good.
And so I'm working. I mean, Proverbs but like I'm getting there.
Yeah.
But the you saying it is like it's so true. I hear that a lot where it's like, yeah, like you said, the whole I like your Christ, not your Christians. It's such a great way of putting it, because they go to Sunday, and on Sunday everything's good.
Yeah.
And then Monday, and then next thing you know, it's like you're not following through in what it is that Christ says.
Right.
As a follower of Christ.
Yes.
That's my favorite thing that you talk about, and you talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. Another one is let's see. This one is tough, but just pain and suffering. You know, if God exists, why do bad things happen to good people?
Yep. Well,
It's a tough
you just
one.
asked me the biggest theological question,
Yes.
so I will not have a 30-second answer.
I know.
For you that solves this.
We
And
could have 3 episodes just to this question, just to these questions.
And it is a big question. It's a question that I have, right? So why wouldn't I expect other people to have it? I will say this. I have found that God is with us in our pain, right? So even if I can't explain why the pain, I do think it is a front door actually to people experiencing the presence of God. I also see him use our pain for purpose in dramatic ways. There are so many people at Suncrest who have gone through rough things, and then when they say, well, what does God want me to do with my life? A lot of times it relates back to some rough thing they went through, and now this is how they think God could use them in their life. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I say about Christianity is just to set the expectations the right place, because not only does Christianity, it doesn't teach that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Like that's not the message of Christianity. Actually, at the core of Christianity, if you think about it, the worst possible thing happened to the best possible person. This is Jesus going to the cross, right? Our whole faith actually is fundamentally resting on not the assumption that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It is resting on the assumption that this is an unjust world, and people who are going to trust in God will have to go through suffering in order to bring justice back to the world.
So good. That was awesome. The questions on the Bible. I've heard some really good, as I've, like I mentioned, 2024 for me is really diving into the Word. Yep. And people will say, yeah, the Bible's a few thousand years old, written by a bunch of people. Mm-hmm. We don't have the original, right? Mm-hmm. All these types of things. Mm-hmm. Which, again, valid understanding. It's like, did some random people write these books? Mm-hmm. I think that one thing as studying history, even people who are the greatest of historians, who are agnostic, atheist, whatever it is, mm-hmm. acknowledge the fact that Jesus existed.
Yes.
And so that is one thing I think that if you can't at least acknowledge that, I think that that's just a kind of a point of like, all right, look a little further into it, because people who mm-hmm. maybe believe the same as someone who, hey, I don't believe in anything. I don't believe in I don't believe in God. I don't believe. Those people at least can acknowledge Jesus Christ existed. But in regards to the Bible, it's like people who say, hey, the Bible's a few thousand years old, written by a bunch of people. We don't have the original one. Mm-hmm. Again, we could spend a week on this. Yeah. A month on this. But
so, little plug here. I'm actually teaching on this very thing for 1 week this weekend. Nice. So, after this is out, if you Google "misunderstanding the Bible" and Suncrest, you'll find it on YouTube.
Sweet.
But
we'll tag that.
There's a couple of things that are, I think, fundamentally important. I'm gonna come one step back from even the question you asked, because I believe there is a shared assumption that's actually a false assumption that's actually shared by people who are Christians and people who aren't Christians. And the assumption is this: that the Bible is the foundation of our faith, right? Now, I mean, you know me. You know how important I think the Bible is, right? Yes. But the Bible is not the foundation of our faith. And the reason I know that is because the Bible says it is not the foundation of our faith, right? The foundation of our faith is Jesus Christ. It's a person. It's not a book. Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of our faith. And the scriptures actually say that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is what the entire faith stands on. If the Bible says, if the resurrection isn't true, you should not be a follower of Jesus, right?
Exactly.
This is all a farce,
Exactly.
right? If the resurrection is true, you should be a follower of Jesus. And that is the foundation of our faith. I'm not saying the Bible isn't important. I'm not saying it's not God's word. I believe that it is. But here's what happens. People will take a dispute they have with the Bible. Oh, it was old. It was not, whatever. They'll pull out something that's troublesome to them.
Yep.
And if the Bible is the foundation of your faith, and you can find one thing that's troublesome for you,
Throw it out.
it's a house of cards, right? It all falls over. And I'm like, that's not even logical. Like most people who want to have these conversations are logical people. I'm like, think about it. So if Jesus is who he said he was, which is verified by dying and rising from the dead, you're going to let a little problem you have with a passage in Leviticus trump that? That's not even logical.
Yeah, right.
Right? So let's build the foundation on the right piece. And then appreciate that the Bible was written thousands of years ago, which actually is partially a reminder that when you and I are reading it today, it's worth kind of an extra layer of examination of our different cultural contexts when it gets read. Be a historian a little bit. Appreciate the different sections of the Bible.
Yeah.
The largest section of the Bible is the Old Covenant that's contained in the Old Testament, and we can learn all kinds of things from it. But it's not our covenant if we're followers of Jesus. It's not. Actually, the New Testament says that the Old Covenant is obsolete. Right. It was fulfilled. It's complete. And so you can read things in the Old Testament, but our faith isn't built on the Old Testament, right? It's valuable. It teaches us things, but it's not there. So it's like, have a good, healthy, be willing to dive to the next level of your intellectual questions to say, would I embrace this?
Yeah.
So.
If you read the Bible and you just listen to the principles and the values that are spoken, it's a good way of living. And I look at that's just for me, it's like the most logical thing. It's like, okay, people say that the Bible is BS for whatever reason. If you just did what the Bible taught, you can have an impact on society. You can be a good friend, a good person, and at the bare minimum, it's like I'd at least want to listen to those things and try to follow those things.
This is it, Alex, because one of the things I tell people is that the Bible wasn't even completely assembled until the 4th century, right? So for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there wasn't the Bible. They had John's gospel or Mark's gospel. They had stories, and we should actually maybe benefit from treating it the same way. Like, just start with the gospels. Right? Yeah. Just read the story of Jesus.
That's why you told me that. That's why I started to do that.
And then whatever Jesus says, try to put that in your life. And you hear me say this all the time because we have people who aren't Christians who come to Suncrest. And I always try to divide the room. I'm like, hey, so for those of you who are followers of Jesus, like we've committed our lives to this. This is our covenant. We're going to go live this out, right? Those of you who aren't followers of Jesus, 90% of the time, I'm like, and this would be good for you too, right? Or at least good for the world around us, right? If you care about the world around us. Maybe 10% of the time there's some teaching of Jesus where if you're not a follower of Jesus, it wouldn't make sense for your life. But most of the time,
it does.
It's like just start stepping into it, practice it, and then see where it goes.
This is a total side note, but I just thought about it. In reading, I thought this was hilarious, and I want a pastor's response to this.
Okay.
I was reading... I'm in Matthew. I think it was Matthew maybe 21, where Jesus, the fig tree. Jesus is hungry, right? And he goes to the fig tree, and there's no fruit on the leaves or on the tree, and so he cursed the tree and killed the tree. And I thought that was hilarious. I wrote on my Bible. I said, "This is hangry Jesus." Like Jesus was hungry, and he's like, "There's no fruit here. You're dead." I'm like, Jesus was just like us.
Yeah.
He was a person. He's like, I'm hangry. I'm a little mad. This tree's dead. And I'm like, that is, and then he gave a lesson. Like he gave a response to that to the disciples. They were amazed. He's like, how did you do that? And essentially it was, hey, if you too can have the ability to do this based on your belief and your faith and so on. You can move the mountains and so on. But I thought that was the fun. There's more to this, I'm sure. Because I'm looking at it but I read that and I'm like, dude, I get hangry Jesus got hangry just like me, man.
Yes. So, I mean,
he killed the tree.
Are there deeper theological truths to that?
Exactly.
Sorry, there are. But this is the point, right? Actually, one of my favorite things about the New Testament, it's written in the Greek language, and there's classical Greek and there's Koine Greek. Koine Greek is the everyday language. It's like almost like slang, right?
Okay.
And that's what the New Testament, this document that shaped the world for 2,000 years, it's everyday stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a legitimate Like, hey, I'm reading the scriptures, and this is what I notice. And obviously, I think through the lens of theology, but Jesus was fully human.
Yes.
That's fundamental.
Yeah.
To also fully divine.
Yeah.
But fully human. And so he wept.
Yeah.
He was hungry. He was tired. Actually, the scriptures say he experienced everything we experience. And I think that's a great observation.
I don't know. I was cracking up by it.
Yep,
Anyway,
good.
I thought it was funny because I showed my wife. I'm like, babe, hangry Jesus,
Angry
man.
Jesus.
If I had that power,
That's gonna
I
show
would
up.
kill that tree too, man. But no, he's like, you will never bear fruit again. I'm like, he's just anyway. And I think one of the last things, and this ties into kind of our last conversation. Again, I would love to do this again because I think we're probably at an hour right now, 50 minutes. Yeah. Or what are we at? How long? 50? Cool. Get another 10 minutes in or so. This kind of ties into the last topic, but also everything for the most part. And in a world where I think the biggest thing for me that helped me really develop my faith is that it's just realizing in the world that we live in, there's good and there's bad. Mm-hmm. There's evil and there's good. Mm-hmm. And the whole concept of where does that come from, right? That's a totally different conversation. But also, evil in many ways just comes from the form of pure desire. And I want to.
Yeah.
So now this goes into the last two topics that I wanted to touch on. And people say this, hey, I have a desire to do X, Y, Z.
Whatever.
The Bible tells me not to do that, and I don't want to live that way. Mm-hmm. Respect. I have learned, at least from my life and my faith, is that is evil. Like the desire to say, okay, and it's all by design. Jesus said that the ruler of this earthly world is the devil. Mm-hmm. So most people don't realize that. People think like, okay, the who rules the earth? It's God. No. Jesus himself said the devil rules this earth. Mm-hmm. That started from the time when the first men and women were deceived. Yep. When you tie everything together, this is either the greatest story that's ever been made up, that is so well thought. I firmly believe no human can come up with what God has done. Yeah. Because when you simply boil it down, it's like there's good, there's evil. And it started when God made the world. And that little serpent came up and was like, no, this can happen. And as soon as man had free will to make a decision, the devil, evil, Lucifer, Satan, gained control of humans. And so this whole idea of, no, I have a desire to do something. Yeah. I want to eat that apple. I want to look at that beautiful woman even though I'm married. Yep. Hey, there's pornography. Well, my wife's not doing it for me right now because we just had kids and or hey, you know what? I would like to hook up with, or I would just want to focus on money and building my business and all these desires. You have all these desires. And Jesus also said that the devil is so cunning, so crafty, right? That when you think about it, that makes sense. It made sense to me. I'm like, there's evil, there's good. If evil was if evil was like, hey, in your head, hey, Alex, you should kill that guy. Right. Well, that's the devil. Right. He's not that dumb.
That's not how he works.
That's not how he works. He makes it, he brings it up in a way where it's like, hey, you deserve that. Right. You work so hard for this. You deserve to have that feeling of buying that thing, or you deserve to, go out and hey, let everyone know how amazing you are. You deserve to, hey, your girlfriend's not getting it done, but that would do it. Yep. It's all he reasons with you, right? Yeah. And when all of that started to make so much sense to me as time went on in my life, and I started to discuss this with people around me about 4 or 5 years ago. I think that this is way more prevalent in the world that we live in now, where everything that we see, this is kind of culturally and today and in our youth, but all day long, we're just exposed to things that we should desire. Mm-hmm. Social media, it's going to show you everything that you want. The media and schools pushing religion out, and just, hey, whatever it is that you want. Yep. The devil doesn't want to, I think you said this the other day, the devil doesn't want us to worship him. Right. The devil wants us to worship ourselves. Yes. And that's what's being pushed into our world. And when you think about it, it's like, it makes sense. Like in your mind, you're like, of course I want to do what I want to do. Right. Why don't I go do what I want to do? Why? Religion wants me to go do these things. No. I want to go do what I want. And when you look at the world now, everything is based on your your personal desires.
Yeah.
You want to go do this? You should go do that.
Mm-hmm.
And the devil reasons with you to make it make sense.
Mm-hmm.
That is when I started to really understand the way that God works.
Yeah.
And I think that's the world that we're living in. And there's so many, culturally and especially with our young kids, they're under attack. Like they're under attack. And I think that, and I don't want to focus on all the negative, like, just all of these things. I want to focus on the fact that I think that a lot of people are aware of that.
Yeah.
And I love what you said. Keep that door open. If you're a teenager, just keep the door open because you're experiencing things like, oh, well, maybe, and all the way down to the most trivial things that we could discuss. Maybe I'm not a boy, right? Maybe I'm a girl. I like that girl. Maybe, all of these things you start to all start going, that's my desire. This is what I want. And you should act on that. It's your desire. You should act on that. That's what you should do. And I think that is when I really started to understand faith and how God works and how more, even for me, as importantly, how desire and the devil works.
Yeah.
Because I had all these things coming to my mind and they all made sense to take action on.
Oh my goodness. So, opening story of the scriptures, Adam and Eve, right?
Yes.
Temptation, garden. Do you know the line that the evil one uses? There's this tree with fruit on it, and you might expect he's the devil, right? He's probably like, go eat that fruit. Like, no, he's not doing that. That's not the way he says. Did God really say not to do that? He's just going to create a little doubt. Like, man, actually, maybe God's holding out on you. Maybe God has something, but it would be better over. That's all he has to do. He just has to seed the conversation, and we take the hook.
Yes.
Right? That's what human beings are prone to do. But I do think the idea of it's not just following our desires, it is following our individual desires that gets at the core of how corrupt this gets inside of us. That each person has their own identity, and that you kind of lose your identity of, if you're a Christian, your identity is with God. But even if it wasn't that, like, what's the value of a community? Like, I hear you say this. I feel the same way about where I grew up. It's like, oh, there was a time where I'm like, I grew up in Crown Point. Crown Point stinks, whatever. And now after a little while, I'm like, actually, it's awesome. Yeah. And I'm glad I'm from here. What do you have inside of you, Alex? You have a sense of community. So when you're making decisions, you're not just making decisions for Alex. You're part of a community, right? Same thing's true with our families, immediate nuclear family or extended family. Yes. My parents taught me it matters if your last name's Lee. Yes. Right? To be a Lee matters. And I teach my kids that. Exactly. We have an identity as a family.
I've learned this from mentors, and I'm doing that all the time.
Right?
Hey, my dog will be like, I did this. I'm like, you're a Nicola. Of course you did that.
Yes.
Of course you could do that.
But the moment our identity gets reduced to being only an individual, I'm not thinking about my family anymore. I'm not thinking about my community. I'm certainly not thinking about God. And then each person just does whatever they want because we just do our desires, and we feel like, well, whatever desire I have. And we should not be shocked that this is a very broken world when each person thinks the right thing to do is whatever I want to do.
Yes. Yeah, and that's, again, I don't think that it's by accident. See, my mom, I like to make this joke, but I always reference back to it, and I should have kind of started with it. My mom always said, when I was younger, my mom was like Bobby Boucher's mom. You guys ever watch Waterboy?
Yes.
Okay, my brother and I joke about this all the time. That foosball is the devil. Everything. And then, Bobby Boo, everything the devil do you, mama. And then, I like school. And then, oh my God. And then Vicky Valancourt. Anyway.
I watched The Waterboy at the Crown Theater right over here when it was out many years ago.
And she showed me her boobies, and I like them too. That's one of the best.
You can do it.
Yeah. I love that movie. But my mom was that lady. And when you're young and you're a teenage boy, my brother and I are like, oh, that's the devil,
Yeah.
But now that I talk about it, I joke about it all the time. I'm like, that is the devil.
Yeah.
Like I'm becoming Bobby Boucher's mom. I'm becoming my mom. That's the devil. But I don't think it's by accident. Mm-hmm. I don't. Jesus told us this would happen. Yeah. And when you get, and this is all the theology stuff that I don't want to go over the everyday person head. It goes over my head. Mm-hmm. But when you really start to look all the prophecies and things that Isaiah and like all this stuff I'm learning from you, and all these things have been told to us.
Yeah.
See, so Jesus said, that's who rules the world. And you look at, I'm not, again, social media is the devil. Well, when you look at what's happening in ways, it's creating that individualism. No. I want to do this for me, and that's it. What happens to the world when that happens? If everybody lived that way.
Yeah. Yeah. You just have to play it out, right?
Versus if everybody lived in, like, the whole idea of, religion, God, faith, the nuclear family, having kids, getting married. All of those things are being pushed to, like, why would you want to do that? You want to have kids? You know what? That's going to take away from you traveling, right?
Right.
Oh, that's a reasonable thing. You start questioning all these things, and then you watch someone on on TikTok who traveled 20 times this year, and you're like, I want that, and then you start to compare, and then so all of these things are valid, but I look at that and I'm like, as my mama used to say, that's the devil, and the most fulfilling things for me in life are my sonship as a child of God. I learned that at a men's retreat at Cross Point Church. I love those guys over there. I went on that men's retreat 3-4 years ago. It changed my life. And this is kind of, and I'll get to the point on this. I'll talk about that, and then we can finish up. But, but it's being a son of God, my marriage, and my kids. Those are not even close the most, and then my community. Those are not even close the most fulfilling things to me in life. I've tried things for myself. The way that it works, the only way that it works is when you go after those individual things. Is every time you need more. Every time you need more. Every time you need more. You're always left unfulfilled. And do you think that's on accident? No. I don't think it's on accident. I just the idea of like, nope, and I'll get into this, figure this, but I was a very weak man for a long time. For a long time. And people around me would think that I wasn't at that time. But when I went to that men's retreat about 4 or 5 years ago, and I started to realize, like, God, dude, when I was going at the desires that I wanted, I'm like, I want this for me, I would go for it. That is so easy to do. It's so easy to be like, yeah, I want to go do this. And so I'm going to go do that. That's a weak man. I was a weak man. Like, this is my desire, I'm going to go do that. A strong man is a person who thinks, what's better for my family, what's better for the people around me, what's better for my kids. I didn't have kids at this time. I was barely married. What's better for my marriage, what's better for my community is not doing exactly what I want for me. Instead, there's more to this. So I started to share with the guys around me that I had this kind of, and again, at this point, I'm not like, I would call myself a Christian, but I just, again, the door was open and I'm studying, I'm learning. And I'm like, I'm going to start talking about these things with guys. Hey, guys, I'm struggling with this. And it was desires more so on the, and I found that by talking about this, I have way more people who have expressed to me, hey, I struggle with the same things. I started to talk about with my friends. Like, guys, I think if I were to actually break this down, I don't want to be that person. When I was in high school, even in high school, I knew. I'm like, every time I'd be like, I shouldn't have done that. And then so I started talking to guys about this. I'm like, hey, I'm struggling with this. And they're like, me too. Every single one. And so then I was like, okay, one, I'm not weird. But two, I don't want to be like this. And so again, that's just one example of like, I was a very weak man, and now realizing it's like, you can't just fall to the desire of what I want from me at any moment in time. What that's done for my marriage is so far beyond what I could explain. That's how God works. And for me, I can't, if you just think, and I could share a story after story, and I might share one, but if you, I understand the concept, that's all just a coincidence. And for me, you'd have 29 years of explaining to do. Because every single day there's coincidences that happen as I talk to God and say, God, I made a mistake here. And God just keeps answering. Maybe not exactly how I want the answer to be. A lot of times even better. Better than I can imagine. So I think that the world right now needs more, and this is, I can relate to this because now as a father and a husband, we need more men who will not be weak to just say, this is what I want and I'm going to go do it. That's easy. And by the way, I'm telling you, I've been there. And by the way, I'm still there at times.
We give in,
every day. Every day. So, but to be a man that, like, the world needs more strong men that are going to say, no, that's not right. I know that's not right. I may want that, but that's not right. So anyway, I'm sorry.
I just want to make a couple observations because, the weak man, strong man thing, I want, especially guys who are listening to this, it's actually true for women too. Like, embrace that idea. And I'm like, what changed when Alex got strong? The answer is actually, in a group of guys, he admitted something out loud. He said, listen, I struggle with this, right? And none of those other guys were going to say it out loud until you said it out loud, right? But then once you say it out loud, that has power, right? Like, oh, we've all kind of said it out loud. There's some friendship, there's some accountability in doing the right thing. It breeds the right discussions. So I'm like, I think that's part of the strength, is not isolating yourself and trying to deal with it all yourself. That's an individualistic thing too. But it's like, hey, a circle of people around you, and you might have to go first, right? You probably wish someone else would go first, but a strong man, step into it, right? Yeah. The other thing I want to say is, of course, what we're not saying here is that all desires are evil, right? I think if we think about this a little bit, what you'll start to capture is there are low-level desires and there are high-level desires. And actually what's happening, and this is the journey I hear you telling, is that we have some instincts to go for the lowest level desires that have short-term feelings attached to them. But you have a desire to be a great dad. Yep. You have a desire. It's a genuine desire in you to be a leader in our community, to be a faithful follower of Jesus. And those are true desires. They're just competing desires. And you have to let the higher, more noble desire win rather than just grabbing what's
that low-hanging fruit.
Just right there.
Yeah. That's such a good way of putting it. And I think for me, like, man, I don't know how to explain it, but a lot of things, not everything changed once I became a father. Mm-hmm. And for anybody that's like, has that, like, I knew as a kid, Matthew McConaughey said in his book, Green Lights, I read, it was a great book. He said, I didn't know what I wanted to be growing up. He goes, I just knew I wanted to be a father. And when he said that, I'm like, that, I relate to that. Cause like, I just knew even when I was a kid, I was like, yeah, I'm going to be a dad one day. I mean, no one ever asked me, but like in my mind, I'm like, I'm going to be a dad. If you like the whole idea that like having kids is a burden, and by the way, it's the hardest thing I've ever done.
Right.
It's also the single most rewarding thing I've ever had in my life. But when my daughter was born, I was like, I can't be that guy.
Right.
Before she was born, and I found out, I'm like, I can't. Who do I want to be for her?
Yep.
And your level of accountability went to a different. And then also you're mentioning to other people like, hey, these guys, I want to work on this. So all of a sudden, before it was like just between me and the devil.
Yeah.
You know, hey man, it's not a big deal. But as soon as I was like, I got this little girl, and I got my wife, and I have these people, and now you create this community. It's like there was 12 disciples, man.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
Jesus had 12 guys around him. It's like we could learn from that. And so I think that the one thing that I want to say, you know, in relation to this is like, I'm not, first off, not everything's resolved, and I'm not good for the next 70 years. You know, these are constant, never-ending things that come up. And you said, hey, there's higher level desires and so on. The way that God has enriched and blessed our life in so many ways because of like, all right, that's a low level. I'm going for this one. And hey, God, I'm working on this and so on. And the way in which that he's blessed our lives in ways that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
The way he's blessed our marriage from these things that I want to focus on.
Yep.
The way that he's blessed our business. The way, all those things. When you start to just, all right, God, I'm struggling with this and I'm giving this to you. And that's, I can't explain it other than like, I just started to let these things go. And I think it was in Matthew as well. I can't be wrong. But, or no. It was different. I can't remember, but you'll know. As God says, in your weak, when you are weak, God is our strength, right?
Yes.
In our weakness, that is when God is our strength. And when you know, like, that's what God says, like, hey, when you're weak, I'm your strength.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you feel weakness, that is when God is the strongest.
Yeah.
For you. So, like that, I needed to hear that once. I'm like, gosh, man, just like let that go. Anyway.
The sentence right before that passage is God saying, my grace is sufficient for you, right? My power is made perfect in your weakness, right? And I think that's it. We repel weakness. We don't want to be perceived as weak. But actually, when I can acknowledge my weakness, my wretchedness, my brokenness, that's when the grace of God pours in. And now it's not about me anymore. It's back to the conversation we were having earlier.